right, so we're as live as we can be. Instagram doesn't seem to love us, so we won't be going to Instagram today. But we are here now, and Anthony and I are going to be doing 5 weeks with you guys to talk to you about hormone balance, alignment of your hormones. And we're going to be covering insulin and cortisol, and we're doing a 2 parts on just the sex hormones. We're talking about thyroid hormones. So you guys buckle down for your next couple of Mondays and put this on your calendar, because we're going to be pulling apart all of the hormones. And then on the last week, the 6th week, we're going to be doing a special event that we'll be talking to you about later. So let's get into this today. We're going to spend all of today on just one of the most common hormones that people struggle with, is cortisol. So Anthony, you want to explain to people like just what cortisol, the cortisol, cortisol is? Because I mean, people say, oh, my cortisol levels must be high, or my cortisol must be burned out. But like, what are they actually talking about?
Well, this is so corny, what I have to say. Is Instagram not working, raising your cortisol?
It is raising my cortisol.
Yeah. So cortisol is one of many hormones that are produced by the endocrine system. So if you ever visited with an endocrinologist, it's probably about your thyroid, but cortisol plays a role in that whole cascade. It has a very, very bad reputation, cortisol, because as soon as if you go into Google, you type in cortisol, like you'll see many, many, many hits on stress hormone, and it is. But let's start this discussion with some of the good things that cortisol does for you. Don't fall down after I tell you this, but cortisol is actually anti-inflammatory. Yes.
What?
Cortisol.
Did you say anti?
Cortisol is anti-inflammatory, and then it plays roles in other things, like it can elevate blood sugar levels. Actually, it's one of 4 hormones that can raise blood sugar levels. The body's interesting. We have 1 hormone to lower glucose in the blood. We have 4 to increase glucose in the blood, and cortisol is one of those 4. Insulin is the opposite. Insulin is the only hormone which we're going to talk about in the upcoming weeks, that gets glucose out of the blood and drives it into the cells. But cortisol also plays a role in blood pressure, but we need it, so it can't be bad. We need it, but it's produced 100% by the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are one of many glands, part of that back to the endocrine system. They sit on top of your kidneys. They're about the size of a walnut, but they're shaped more like a cashew. And they generate lots of hormones, cortisol being one of them. They generate sex hormones. We'll get into that. And they generate stress hormones more than just cortisol. But cortisol, our bodies work off of something called circadian rhythms. So that means for cortisol, our circadian rhythm, a healthy circadian rhythm for cortisol, when we wake up, our cortisol level should be high. So if anybody knows, and if you want to put it in the chat or whatever, there's a balance between cortisol, and my question was, what chemical or neurotransmitter or what does the body produce that helps us go to sleep? So if anybody knows, put that in the chat. But there's an inverse relationship. So back to circadian rhythms, morning cortisol should be highest, and then as the day progresses, it declines and it's lowest at night. And if you guessed melatonin for the sleep hormone, cortisol and melatonin have an inverse relationship. So if cortisol is high at night where it should be low, you think you're going to be able to fall asleep? Probably not, because your melatonin is going to be very low if cortisol is high. So cortisol is not all bad. It also is catabolic, means it will break down muscle if we're in a chronic, sustained state of stress. So when we're stressed, regardless if it's physical stress, emotional stress, our body doesn't care but the difference between the two. It doesn't know the difference between the two. If we're stressed, whether it's a capital S stress or a small s stress, our body's going to create cortisol. And again, in the short term, that's no big deal. It's a healthy, normal response to generate cortisol when we're stressed. It's just as humans, where we blow it and we keep recreating the past, and we live in the past, and we live in this stress state, and we're chronically stressed. That's where things start to go wrong, because cortisol will just stay elevated more than our bodies were designed for it to be, and then we start running into issues. So
Right.
on
Hold your thought
labs,
there for a second. Hold on.
yeah,
So when Anthony was talking before about the cortisol levels being high at night, this is a flipped cortisol pattern. So those of you who identify as a night bird, you're somebody who loves it at night. I used to identify that way too, thinking I was different and I didn't run the same way. Well, it's because of the way my body was processing stress. So at night, my cortisol levels were way higher, and in the morning, they were way lower. So those of you who wake up in the morning after 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 hours of sleep and you still feel wrecked, you typically are probably up against a cortisol pattern that's been flipped. And those of you who have it in your head that you're a night owl, that isn't just how we work. We actually, if we're working with the circadian rhythms, we are going to sleep at the right times when it's dark out, and we are waking up when it's starting to get light out. That's us naturally working with our systems. So if you're leaning into no, I'm just a night owl, and you're leaning into that identity, it actually may be throwing your cortisol levels off even more. So a lot of our clients, exactly, when we have shift work clients, we have third shift, second shift, they're working past those hours, and they're trying to force their bodies to stay awake, leaning on things like caffeine or other substances to keep them awake when the body wants to be asleep. You can really, really mess with your cortisol levels, which will then, in fact, mess up the entire cascade of hormones. So, right. Anthony, I apologize for jumping in, but I thought that was a good point.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I mean, and it's this isn't so important. There's this cascade of events that happen from the hold on. I'm trying to remember the part of the brain that kicks off the amygdala. That's it. So this whole cortisol cascade kicks off from the amygdala. So it's several steps that happen. It's not just the adrenal glands themselves are the one who ideally produce cortisol, because they produce cortisol because of the signal they're getting from the amygdala, and then there's many steps. But anyway, if your practitioner ever runs blood work and they run morning cortisol, optimal levels, regardless of what the normal levels say, optimal levels are between 10 and 15 micrograms per deciliter. We prefer, there's a saliva version of this, and then there is a Dutch test, which is a urine part of this, where they'll look at your cortisol levels throughout the day. And then you're looking at your circadian rhythms throughout the day, so you can kind of see what your adrenals are doing with regards to cortisol production, and see if that pattern follows high in the morning and then gradually declines to low at night. And yeah, there you go. There's my soapbox on cortisol. So it's not all bad. We need it. It's part of a healthy, normal response. It's just when it's sustained and we're in a chronic state of stress, regardless if you're thinking all day about the fight you got into with your daughter early in the morning, or the email that your boss sent you that irritated you, and you just keep thinking about that all day. Those are the things that will just keep your cortisol levels elevated. And the body cannot be in a healing and a stress state at the same. Well, let me rephrase that. Our body can be in a healing and stress state at the same time. It's just we want to be more in a healing state than a stress state. We want the healing to be more of a dominant effect than the stress.
So I'm gonna capitalize on the fact that you brought up the amygdala during all of this too. So the amygdala is also part of the brain that is the emotional part. It's the part that decides whether it's the instinctive part. It's the hardwired part. It's the part that decides whether you're safe or not. So when Anthony was referring to stress before and saying the body doesn't really care about the stress as far as where it comes from, that is absolutely correct, right? So if the body is stressed out, thinks it's in trouble, thinks it's in danger because of an emotional stressor, the body doesn't see that any different than a physical stressor. So it doesn't differentiate. So if you're in a chronic state of stress, whether you're physically stressing yourself out, if your body has food sensitivities and you're eating foods it doesn't like, if your body has food allergies, you're just eating inflammatory foods, that's a physical stressor. If you are stressed because you're worried and jumping into the future all the time and playing what if games, or you're trying to be perfect, you identify with being a perfectionist, you're trying to get things right all the time, you're terrified that you might get something wrong. You're worried about everyone else's state of being except for your own. You're putting yourself last. They're all high-level stressors for the body. And when your body is spending more of its energy, more of its time on worrying about the stressors or controlling or trying to defend against these stressors, it doesn't have the energy. It doesn't have the resources to manage what's really going on and to get into a real serious healing space. As we continue to get older, these challenges feel like they get worse, not because we're older, but because we've reinforced these patterns and these behaviors over time. So it gets harder and harder and harder to undo those patterns and make your body know that it's safe without some of these old patterns of putting everybody else first, or panicking when you see an email from your boss. So these are old patterns, right? So the amygdala decides whether it is, if you're safe or not. It goes back to instant knee-jerk reactions and how do I put myself into a safer position? So then it shoots out cortisol and it starts trying to manage the situation and lower the inflammatory response. But then it gets the body all hyper focused on what's going on in front of me, this bear, this fear, this problem. So like Jody's asking, what does it mean if you have low cortisol? What causes low cortisol? So she's looking at it from the other side. So there's two different factors here, and I'm going to kick this back to Anthony. But you end up with low cortisol either because you've burned out the cortisol levels, you've made so much that your body is struggling so much it can't even get up to make the high levels of cortisol, or your body is in a state where it doesn't realize that there's a problem, but there is. So Anthony, you want to kick into what you see with our clients on that?
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate the question. I'm glad you mentioned it because, like Kirsten was saying, there's three states of cortisol function. There's optimal, where that circadian rhythm is in line with what it should be. There's high cortisol, which usually happens in the earlier stages, meaning that when someone begins to, their life changes, a situation changes, and they have some high emotional charge, and then the beginning states of chronic stress, that's when the adrenals are producing high amounts of cortisol. So that's another state. Then, as Kirsten was saying, if this goes on and on over and over for years and years and years, the adrenals, you may hear the term adrenal fatigue. We don't really call it that. We call it more adrenal dysfunction, where the adrenals are just waving the white flag. They're like, I got nothing. And they can't produce, right? They just can't produce sufficient amount of cortisol, regardless of the time of day. But because of the inverse relationship with melatonin and cortisol, when we wake up, there's a reason why cortisol is high. It's your get up and go, hormone. And if levels are low, then you're going to have no energy, and it's not going to be fun. But cortisol, a little biochemistry, cortisol is nutrient dependent. Like, in order for your body to make cortisol, it needs vitamin B5 or pantothenic acid. So I don't ever recommend guessing. Even if your symptoms line up 100% with a condition, I don't ever suggest guessing. I would say run labs. Why guess when you can know? Look at a cortisol rhythm test, where you test your cortisol throughout the day via saliva every 3 or 4 hours and see what the pattern is like. Or do a Dutch test, which is way more involved than just cortisol. It also looks at hormones, but part of it is your 24-hour cortisol pattern to see exactly what your cortisol levels look like. Just don't guess. Oh, I must have low cortisol because I have no energy, or I must have high cortisol because I'm under chronic stress. I'm not saying you're not correct, but why guess when you could know?
Yeah, and with those kinds of things, when there are hormones involved, it starts to get really interesting. There are so many things that impact similar things, similar symptoms to low cortisol. And what we see a lot of times is people go to functional medicine doctors and they do thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of tests, which we're not necessarily recommending that either. But they end up going, or we see them going to people and they're being treated for things because the doctors are so used to seeing them with clients or patients that they just start automatically treating them with stuff. Well, it probably is a hormone issue. Well, it's probably a parasite issue. Well, it's probably a SIBO issue. And then they put you on certain protocols right away. And so there's no way to really know, was that really kind of the core factor? But really, if you dig deeper and you go into more of the root issues on this, we still want to look at people and say, are the basics being managed first? Right? Because we have so many clients who will come to us and say, oh, I have these issues and I'm fatigued and I'm this, it must be my hormones. We're like, well, your hormones are probably involved because they're always involved somehow. But let's look at the basics. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you drinking enough water? Are you eating a diet that helps sustain what's going on in your body? Are you eating enough food? Are you eating foods that don't satisfy the needs that you have nutritionally? So we look at some of the basics. What's going on with bowel movements, right? So we start looking at that. Then we start looking kind of at their life structure. Are they putting their needs, their own health needs, way or higher on the list? Or are they just coming whenever they get some opportunity to focus on their own needs? Getting like a massage once in a while isn't necessarily self-care, right? So we start looking at the basics first. Then once you get into those and then you're not seeing the shift that you'd like, or if you don't see the shift you like or to the level that you like, then we start looking at that, the saliva test. Anthony and I look at our own stuff like once a year. We pretty much do a big a lab test, thyroid, hormones. We look at all of it because, we're both over 50 now and, we start to look at things. I just eked my way. 50. I am 5 minutes over 50, but I'm still in the other decade now. But we've been looking at our hormones and just keeping things in check to make sure the story is going the direction that we want it to, right? And we do look at how stressed out are we emotionally, what's going on with business stuff, what's going on in relationships, what's going on around us. To say, are we putting undue stress on our systems and not giving it the opportunity and the resources it needs to keep us healthier and keep us at a higher level of optimal health? So the spit test, the saliva test is easy. You spit into a little tube 4 times during the day. It took me 15 minutes to get enough saliva to do it. But you do it in the morning, you do it in the middle of the day, you do it at dinner time and then right before you go to bed to get an understanding. Is it going like this where you expected, or your levels going up? Are they jagged? Are they dropping in the middle of the day for a reason? It's helpful information to know. And again, it's just one part of the story.
Right. It's just a piece of information.
Yes. It just helps you get informed about what's going on. It's not the end all be all. If something's off, you don't automatically then try to force that thing back into line. We'll see that with clients that will come to us and say, well, my doctor said my estrogen was low, so we have to replace the estrogen. We have to do this. And our question is, why are we looking at just one thing? Let's look further down the line or up the line and say, what else could be impacting the fact that your body isn't naturally balancing its estrogen along the other side of the other hormones? So, and it's not just because of perimenopause, and it's not just because of menopause, and it's not just because of whatever stories they tend to tell us. There's still more going on that we can control. And hopefully you guys are feeling empowered on this. So where can we get the saliva test? Jody, just shoot us an email and we'll get you
you just send me a message, Jody. I'll
shoot over a message of
give
support.
You some direction.
Support at nourish123.com. So, and those of you who are interested in really going further with what's going on right now, we have some more stuff that's coming up. We're doing this series now. This will be the first of the 5 that we're doing on hormones. So at least stay tuned for next week for what else we're talking about. But if you want to get deeper into what's going on for you and you say, hey, there's more going on here and I don't want to wait those 5 weeks, you can always put yourself on our calendars to have a conversation to say, hey, is this the right time to move forward with something more specific for me? You can always go to nourish123.com/ actually, here, I'll give you this one. You can book a mapping session. What a mapping session will do is we'll have a conversation. It's usually about 20 minutes long to discuss with you what's really going on and kind of map out what we see as the trajectory of where you need to go. And if that trajectory then brings you back to a situation where it looks like it would be a good fit to work with us, we can have that conversation. But at the very least, we're going to at least kind of look at what's going on, give you our expert opinions on what we see. And again, it's a short conversation. It's not a whole big giant health history. You will fill out some information before you get here, so we have a good understanding of what's going on with you. But it's really to hone in on what's really happening at a core level from what we typically see based on where you're trying to go with your healing and your mastery of your own healing in your life. And then we'll have a conversation about what that looks like and where we would recommend you go next with that. And again, if that looks like it's a good fit to work with us, then we can have that deeper conversation as well. So cortisol, again, is one of the important pieces in all this. It's not just the sex hormones. Cortisol is a major component in this. And if you've got diabetes, if you have an autoimmune condition, if you're carrying excess weight that you don't understand why you can't get rid of, if you're not able to gain weight, that's the flip side of this too, right? When you're not able to gain weight, so you're at a weight that is a healthier weight for you. This is part of the process. This is one of the side effects. Right. So if you feel like you've tried all the things, then we do need to have a different conversation, because we're used to feeling that way. I felt like that way for years and years and years. It's just how Anthony and I got into this in the first place, because we couldn't find answers. And I was able to reverse autoimmune diseases and weight gain and all of the other fun side effects of not feeling like you're balanced or not being in balance. So book a session with us if you want to have a deeper conversation about this. It's nourish123.com/map, M-A-P, and we will map out what we see to be the biggest issues or root causes of what's going on, at least the trajectory we see for you. And then we can have a conversation if it looks like it would be a good fit to work together. So, all right. So cortisol checked off the list right now.
Well, technically, cortisol is a sex hormone. Most people don't think it is. But what's interesting when we get more into this, most people think testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. But yeah, cortisol is a sex hormone, and it stems from cholesterol, which we'll get more into another time. So we need to have optimal cholesterol levels in order to make all the sex hormones, and insulin gets progesterone converts into cortisol.
Yeah. So they're part of the same thing. Most people don't see them in that line with the sex hormones.
It's interesting, but it can get very, very complicated. I mean, to be real, we, meaning science, there's so much we don't know still. We know a lot, but there's still so much we don't know, and we're learning stuff every day. And
science is bringing new things to the story, but in the end, it still goes back to a lot of the primary.
It's out of balance. That's what it goes
things,
back to. Yes. Always, every time there's imbalances and out of homeostasis.
So how do we bring you back into balance? So ask yourself that question right now. Where am I out of balance? And I guarantee some of your answers are going to start showing up for you. Thank you, Jody. And I appreciate you too. She said, we've changed your life so much. She's learned so much. And that's what we want for you guys. And you want as, for our clients or anybody who shows up for any of our events, any of our sessions like this, we want you to know more, learn more. I can't tell you how many of our clients come back and say that they felt so much more empowered going in to see any of their doctors or their endocrinologists, because they feel like they got to ask questions at a higher level and they understood how their bodies worked and didn't feel like they were just getting shoveled out of the room and just forced onto hormones or some other medications, because that's not necessarily the answer. For most people, that isn't the answer. So you have to learn how to support your body and what it really needs, so that you can give it what it wants and then you can be in line with it. I also can't tell you how many of our clients will come back and they'll go to their dentist or their doctors and they're doing health histories and they're asked, how many medications they're on, and they're like 0, 0, 0, and their doctors are impressed. And that's the way it should be. But what's the average right now? Is it 4
I think it's
medications?
4.
Yeah, it's 4 medications. The average American is on 4 medications or more.
And you and I are on 0, so that throws off two people, we're talking about.
We didn't throw off the whole population.
Hundreds of millions of people in the country, and
but there are 2 more people who are on more than 4 then. So, but that's what we want for you, to really feel empowered and know what it is that's really going on, how your body is designed to function, how it's designed to also heal and come back from whatever it is that you're dealing with, so you don't have to manage your symptoms. You can actually eliminate them. So All right. Well, you guys have a good rest of your Monday. Schedule this for next Monday. We'll be talking about more hormones for the next 4 weeks after this. So, all right. Have a good rest of your Monday. I'll see you
Awesome.
soon.